Okay, shall we begin? Welcome to old friends and new friends who are here this evening to celebrate our Professor Harry Charrington, who Harry reminded me was awarded his professorship by this institution 10 years ago. And he served as head of the school for a number of those years, and finally, when he stepped down from that role, we can have his inaugural lecture. So welcome everyone, welcome Harry.
Thanks.
Really looking forward to this. And for those who don't know the protocol of an inaugural lecture, which are actually very grand occasions, we get dressed up for them, Samir is going to introduce Harry. Harry will then give his lecture, and then Samir will respond to it, and then we will have a drink, if we haven't started already. So welcome, and I'm going to hand over to Samir at this point. Thanks.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good evening, colleagues. I think some students, and to our external guests and family members, a very warm welcome to the School of Architecture and Cities here at the University of Westminster. My name is Samir Pandya, and I am a long-time colleague of the person that we're here to celebrate tonight, Professor Harry Charrington. So my role this evening is really to introduce Harry ahead of his inaugural professorial talk, which I know will be fascinating, and which effectively will extend Harry's long-standing interest in the histories of modern design practice. Lindsay outlined the format for this evening, so immediately following Harry's talk, he and I will have a brief exchange, and as is customary on these for these inaugural talks, we will not accept any questions from the floor. Your role, I think, as the audience tonight will be to sit back, witness, and simply receive Harry's professing. You will, of course, have unfettered access to Harry during our post-talk celebratory drinks, so please do stick around for that and mingle. So a few words about Harry. Most of you in the room will know that before our current and fantastic head of school, Kate, Harry was head, firstly of the Department of Architecture, and then following a major restructuring, became the inaugural head of the new interdisciplinary School of Architecture and Cities. So his leadership spanned 10 years, during which he had I would say, a profound impact on the physical, educational, and cultural environment of the school. So he enabled colleagues to thrive in many ways. He enhanced our ability to develop and provide a transformational experience for our students. And I think he also equipped our school community to respond to some of the most urgent and challenging societal and environmental issues of our day. It wasn't, of course, always easy. So during Harry's term, he had to lead the school through a number of distinct and very complex periods of crisis and at least significant disruption. And he did so, I would say, with intelligence, with creativity, and one of his most valuable qualities, a kind of deft human touch. It's probably safe for me to say that Harry's, I guess the demands of leadership obscured Harry's identity as a scholar. So it will be a surprise, it may be a surprise to some of you, perhaps even a shock, to know that Harry had a life of inquiry before he became head, and in fact had one throughout his headship, and you can see now that he's actively transitioning into yet another period of intellectual and creative vitality. Now, Harry will describe his journey and his current interests in his own words through his talk, but there are a few things that strike me about his experience and about his practice. I guess the first thing is the breadth of his work. Research, teaching, practice, and leadership. He's worked in diverse spaces across a number of disciplines, at multiple scales and at all levels of education. Combined with this breadth are moments, I think, of incredible depth. I'm thinking in particular, and for example, his work on and at Alvar Aalto Studio in Finland. I'm also thinking of his very deep understanding of architecture's signature pedagogy, Design Studio, which he refined over 15 years of sustained studio teaching across every academic level of architecture's professional route. Of course, there were over the years, the numerous and prestigious awards for his own work, both research and practice, also for the work of his students. For example, I'm thinking here of the number of students of Harry's that won the RIBA President's Dissertation Medal, and I know he is most proud of his students' achievements. So these awards recognised the originality, the creativity, and the intellectual rigour of Harry's work. But perhaps what's not so easily acknowledged or recognised are the values that underpin, I would say, the entirety of Harry's practice and really cut across all of his spheres of influence and activity. Difficult for me to articulate precisely, but what I do know and can say with some confidence, having worked with Harry for many years quite closely, is that his values are underpinned by a politics of respect and of care. It's a politics for me that gains its strength from advocating rather than opposing, from collaborating rather than prescribing, and from listening as opposed to professing. So, at this point, it gives me great pleasure to ask Professor Harry Charrington to begin his inaugural professorial lecture, Helsinki to Kumasi, Stories from the Centre. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Samir. That's, yeah, follow that. So, yes, as Samir said, I have had a life other than being head of school. And what I've done since I stopped being head of school is rather a lot of unpacking. And unpacking resulted in about 10 things that I thought I might do for this lecture. So inevitably this is one of many bits of work, which is a bit of a work of progress. But I thought I'd start by just illustrating what Samir's talked about and just sort of filling in what's behind this lecture and what partly informs this. And it goes back to the 1980s. If the clicker decides it wants to work. Yes, it does. So I had, at the end of my part one, went to Finland and was very fortunate to end up working for Elisa Aalto, who ran Alvaralto & Co. and worked on a number of buildings and got to make things like lamps, and it was rather a special period, rather high bar to practice. So I stayed there for a couple of years, took 2 years out, then came back, did my part two, and after that, rather in contrast, I worked for 5 years in Newcastle for two firms of architects, Cyril Winskill and Spence and Dower, doing an awful lot of renovation on a variety of projects, from the scale of renovating an entire YMCA, which actually precedently turned out to be entirely about understanding fire doors, and some domestic work. And while I was there, I got started that classic 1 day a week PTVL teaching, which turns out to be a strong drug. So I worked and pretty much learned everything I ever learned. Pretty much what I needed to know, whatever question I had, from somebody called Di Leach, who I should really pay tribute to for everything she taught me about studio teaching. And I taught part-time there, and then for a year full-time, and then moved back to Finland. And there I did what I think is called a portfolio career, but just seemed quite chaotic at the time. I did a bit of practice working with Studio Suonto in Finland. This was a project, and I put this up because these are to the east of Helsinki. It's an eastern suburb of Helsinki. They built this new park with a swimming platform and a dance pavilion, which was a really happy thing to do until some bastard burnt it down. And this is what's left, the scorch marks on the trees. And I say this because it's sort of enough to make you want to stop practicing. And then I started teaching again at the Vaasa Institute of Technology up on the west coast of Finland, and a little bit later did some work at the Helsinki University of Technology in the housing studio. I did some competitions, which of course just ended up as a sort of bonfire of hope, as they always do, burning the model that didn't quite succeed for the Finnish embassy in Canberra. And then at the same time, over 6 years, 7 years, rebuilt a derelict house outside Helsinki with my family and pretty much no one else, which was great, very hands-on. Lovely thing working with timber. It's giant carpentry. You can sort of take care of it. And gradually, and this is really the first bit of what would count as research I ever did, was an exhibition held at the then RIBA Heinz Gallery in Portman Square, and then in Jyväskylä in central Finland at the Aalto Museum 2 years later. Exhibition called Process and Culture, which was the first time anyone had just done one building, the drawings, and new photographs from Helene Binet, which was rather a nice thing to do. And then moved back to the UK, moved to Stroud, and this was my first sort of real full-time academic job. And this was a new school in Bristol, which was had been a school of planning, became a school of planning and architecture, and we created this jointly validated undergraduate architecture and planning degree. And ran the first year there for years, ran the course, and then we set up a new M-Arch, the first new M-Arch, part 2, for 35 years. And I ran a studio with a World Health Organization planning center that we had at UE. And we went out and we looked at the places that architects on the whole tend to shy away from, which is places like ring roads, and this is Swindon. And we worked there in groups, and we worked sort of, in this instance, taking a derelict building, an unused building in Norman Foster's old Renault Parts Centre and looking at new uses for it, but also looking at the question of can you retrofit the environment, the car-based environments of places like the Swindon Ring Road, so that they become more sustainable. And that then moved on into a similar project we did in Bristol. As the studio evolved, we developed it into an MA urban design route way, so you could get through the part 2 and come out with an urban design degree as well. And again, we took the Bristol Ring Road, the Bristol Ring Road to do that. At the same time, in Stroud, over a course of 5 years, I was a co-developer of Spring Hill Co-housing, which was the UK's first new building co-housing. Still there, still going well. And again, that sort of resulted in some work I did with 00 Architects, Alistair Parvin. And at the same time, as so many of us do, kept up my own practice, sort of ticking over very small scale works here, there, and so forth. And then went to the University of Bath, and there ran the M-Arch, and I've just picked out something here, something we can't do anymore, which was we ran week-long intense workshops with our Erasmus partners in different European cities. They'd come back to Bath, and we ran them really as exchanges, mixing the tutors and the student groups together. So that's a sort of quick bit of background. Oh, no, there's another thing. Also got involved with conservation as a member of the International Committee for the Viipuri Library, which of course is now in Russia. This is the celebrations of the 70th anniversary. It's all fixed now. It all got fixed with what looked like a really happy outcome. It's a bit of a theme of today's lecture, actually, is the difficulties of the days that we were working in now, because the man who paid for it all in the end was Putin, to be restored. So it's beautifully restored, but nobody can go there anymore. And then I came here, and as Samir mentioned, I ran, I still will run again, dissertation groups, and one of the themes that I kind of noticed that came out of this when I look back on and started putting this lecture together was a kind of continued interest I have in the overlooked, be it the Swindon Ring Road, be it suburbia, be it back gardens like this. And so that was sort of my interest. And what I'm going to do today is talk about why I think we overlook things in architectural history, or sometimes more than that, why we don't overlook them, why we don't recognize things for what they are. And my thesis today is really, I think that on the whole we're telling the wrong stories about architecture, but I think there are ways of rethinking that, in which we recuperate, if you like, the largely tacit habits, skills, judgments through which ideas are translated into buildings and places, which is, after all, the preeminent activity of architects, even if it's not their genius. And I suppose what I really want to kind of get out of this and is some thoughts about how we might actually learn from places we admire. Simplest way of putting today's talk together is we are saturated in imagery, absolutely drenched in it, online, through journals, etc., but particularly online. We have more images and stuff coming at us than we've ever had before, and yet we seem to learn remarkably little from it. I've chosen to do Helsinki and Kumasi for no better reason than they bookend my professional life. I was in Kumasi 6 weeks ago to interview a man called Professor John Owusu-Addo, and I was in Helsinki when I started. They're obviously two very different stories, and they're at very different stages of development and engagement by me. The similarity is that I think the work I'm going to show you and that I want to talk about is outstanding, and I really want to talk about how the projects I'm going to show you were achieved. But I think it's worth making the point about the quality of the work. There's no point, that is the point, isn't it? If work is really good, you want to understand how it's made and learn from that. It is the beginning of it. It's not for the sake of studying something. It's for the sake of studying something that's really positive that you can then begin to emulate. And I believe in the instance, to start on the left, that the Alto Atelier's work is uniquely important in linking excellence and the everyday. Unlike most other modernist architects who built really a very small number of buildings, usually in a few dozen, Alto built prolifically. The Alto Atelier completed over 400 different projects, and it did that magic thing of being able to build well, and to build well in response to a diversity of briefs, budgets, situations, and improve the everyday world through maintaining determined ideas about place combined with a responsiveness to that place. And it did this without any wish to build an object. And what makes the Alto Atelier's work, I think, really interesting and important to contemporary practice is the way that it includes interiors, it includes urbanism, it includes landscape, absolutely as second nature. But back to the idea that this is also about building in response to the world as found. This is Alvar Aalto in 1972, 4 years before he dies. As a child, I played under my father's work desk, a large white table around which 8 surveyors, maybe more, carried out their demanding duties. The solutions were based not only on practical consideration, but on broader goals. In order to perform the work in a satisfactory way, something I would call a society-building realism was needed. Because of this background, I think the incidental aesthetic elements that may exist in my work shouldn't be exaggerated. Realism usually provides the strongest stimulus to my imagination. So by way of example, tuberculosis sanatoria, just in case no one knew where the yellow of this floor came from. It's an homage, of course it is. It's a building that you walk into, it lifts you. 2,000 constructed units of emergency housing at the end of the Winter War, in the Second World War in Finland. The diagram on the left, understanding that what you do is not just build one-offs and then replace them, but you build a cell and then let them be agglomerative things that you can add to as people get resources, as people begin to build up money. Regional plans in backing up in kind of an industrial policy and then building the factories that go with it. And then the development of an extraordinary range of what he called, the Alto Atelier called elastic standardization, finding ways of building, and the similarity I see in this is actually what you see in Georgian buildings, where the building isn't prefabricated in any way, but the components are. The components of the windows, and Alto developed, the Alto Atelier developed new solutions, standardize them, and then find ways of running them out across the buildings, reducing the costs. So there's this balance between the bespoke and the mass-produced, perhaps most famously with this door handle. And then, in turn, using the buildings that Aino, Alva and Elisa Aalto built for themselves as test beds, which they then apply at a larger scale. So that's just a very quick snapshot of Aalto. Let's go to the right-hand image now and to Kumasi. And this is Professor John Owusu-Addo. He's 96. And I think what we'll do to begin with is just hear from him. So we're just going to have to bring that down. And there's so much in this interview. I'm using the audio recording because it's stronger. The main thing that came out of my conversation with him was about being in London in the 50s. John Owusu-Addo, John Addo as he then was, grew up in what was then the British colony of the Gold Coast, came to London on a scholarship in 1952 and studied at the Regent Street Polytechnic. After 6 years, he went back to Ghana, what was then the first independent country in Africa, Ghana, where he built an awful lot. I only found out that he studied here sometime quite recently after going to the Victoria and Albert Museum's Tropical Modernism exhibition. And I sort of pursued interest, found in some very small print the reference that he'd studied here, and then went to our university archive and asked them, has anyone ever followed up this man? And they said, well, not about his time here. So kindly, because of the school's research funding, I got the opportunity to go to Kumasi and talk to him. Particularly nice because it was in a really cold bit of February. And this is him speaking. As I said, he could have shown lots of things that he talks about. But this is him talking about his sort of understandings of design at the university.
You are taught to analyze the building. You always found it difficult from the analysis to the synthesis. It was always difficult. I found it with my students right from almost all the time I taught. They will give you very, very, like sheets and sheets of analysis. But you don't see how this translates into the actual design.
Yeah.
He came with some quality control as well.
Yeah.
Yes. The kind of, for the way they do their work.
As you said, the discipline.
Yes.
The discipline, planning, discipline, elevations, discipline. But you couldn't get it all until you got out. And I started working with Scott.
Right.
Then I got to know. I mean, Miss Van der Rohe was Scott's, champion.
Yeah.
And when you sit down and study, you see it's a discipline.
Yeah.
You have to discipline yourself every elevation. You don't just bring a window in, you have a room here. You've got to synchronize. And it is that part which is difficult. And with the plan, height,
Proportions.
So the three-dimensional.
3-dimension. And it takes you a long time to appreciate 3-dimension. So every time you draw 2 lines, you start thinking of 3-dimension before, and it takes you a long time in the study before you get used to that. I remember one of my mates, Williamson, he was about my age. And he came to me once and said, John, after a jury, John, are you really able to walk through your corridors and so on? I said, sometimes yes. Appreciate the 3-dimension and so on. He said, I can never do that, I'll probably work for somebody all my life.
Okay, just a little sample. Anyway, let's go back to the presentation. Okay, so he as I said, left the Gold Coast, came to Britain, came to London. Extraordinary sort of privilege to talk to this guy. And what comes out of it is what an extraordinarily generous set of hosts he had here, particularly the British Council. It's sort of difficult to imagine the way that they're under such pressure now, what they could do. The education here is sort of almost incidental, but he got it. He got that discipline as he was talking about, and he went back to Ghana, as then was, and worked for an Australian architect called Kenneth Scott, who had a practice in Accra. Then was invited to go to Kumasi by Kwame Nkrumah, the president, to work for the University of Science and Technology. And that is now the KNUST, Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, where later John Owusu-Addo became the first Ghanaian professor of architecture, taking over from Europeans. And he became a really eminent educator in Africa and in the Commonwealth, retiring only in the late 90s. And what he left at, and it exists in KNUST, is, I think, quite an extraordinary body of achievement. And I'll just quickly take you through it. The original master plan Nope. Ah, this is jammed, sorry. Okay, we'll just revert to that. The original master plan is by James Cubitt, and it's from the time of the British colonial authority regime. And in it, he reinforces 3 waterways that run through what is now the campus. And this is now 70 years old. And a series of courts exist, which are sort of more or less open or closed, admitting either bits of landscape or framing particular activities. And the buildings themselves build very much on Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew's work on tropical architecture. They're all naturally ventilated with cross ventilation, shading, and so on and so forth. And when I was there, it was 32 degrees. I'm fairly sensitive to being hot. These buildings work. They are cool enough to be in. They're still not air conditioned, and they're still working beautifully. And there are 3 particular buildings that are really outstanding. One is Cubitt's engineering building. This kind of beautiful resolution of the form of the building, and both in terms of its sort of formal appearance, but in providing shading, an arcade, and natural ventilation, again, cooling the entire building. And then these 2 buildings by John Owusu-Addo himself, one of which is Unity Hall, which is done with 2 Yugoslav architects who worked there as well, Mira Marasovic and Niklos Siko. And he does something really interesting here, and I'll come back to this. He takes the lamellar block that I think we're fairly familiar with in modernism, and combines it with the predominant typology that exists in Ghana and other parts of West Africa, which is the compound. So the building, rather than sitting free in space the way that it does in European projects, it comes down to the ground and meets this compound, which is used for all the communal activities of the building. Whereas earlier in a domestic situation, it would have been used for, say, drying cocoa beans or all the activities of a group of families who exist around the compound. Here, it becomes used for the activities of the students and so on and so forth. And the buildings themselves, again, naturally ventilated, cross vents across there, and the balconies used for shading and, of course, for washing. And then this is the senior staff club from a couple of years later. Again, really designed in response to the climate. The air runs under the building and up through the middle, through this extraordinary staircase, which is immaculately preserved. You imagine if they'd looked after this building. I'm dreaming. But they really have. And again, it's kind of got this real style. And again, but also climatically very responsive. It's wrapped with this barrier, thermal barrier around the building, about 2 meters wide, which allows the building to work like double glazing. It keeps the heat out, keeps it cool. The centre receives water from a pool at the bottom, cooling which rises up, creates an air circulation, cools the building down. It works terrifically. And again, Owusu-Ado in 1966, in a special edition of the AA mag Arena, which he wrote an article with the African-American architect Max Bond, in which he said, unless the role of the architect is based on our real needs, we run the risk of running into the usual architect poses, which are similar to a jeweler creating fine adornments, very nice, very pretty buildings, but which are out of social context. Architects who are too lazy to consider social context are creating pastry. The architects become stars and heroes using twice as much concrete and building more for less, to reverse the slogan. Perfect. And still absolutely up to date. So those are my two kind of frames for what I'm now going to try and talk about. If we go back to Finland, to Aalto's work, and to Helsinki, almost nothing of what I described about that society-building cultural realism of the Aalto's work, and of who did this work, who made these buildings, is actually visible when you look at the coverage of the Aalto Atelier. What you get is more the kind of glossy photographs like this, which reinforce a particular view of both of Finland, buildings in nature, where we see what we want to see, and what we really want to see is pictures, and lots of them preferably. We may praise an architect's work for its sense of place, but it's a place traduced to visual analogies of supposedly eternal natural conditions, which ignore the specific aspects of human affairs. Helsinki's romanticised, Finland's romanticised, and by being romanticised, it's patronised and it's reduced. A process that was defined actually by the Aalto's friend Siegfried Gideon in his book Space-Time in Architecture, when he located an abstracted Finnish society and landscape as remote from the rest of modernism, as he called it, the freedom of the view from the north, or what in 1931 CIAM defined as the creative periphery. Finland, the exception, has become theme and motivation for much coverage of the Aalto Atelier in relation to wider arguments about modernism ever since. And the Finns, not being stupid, have marketed the country as exceptional ever since. In the instance of Kumasi, and things are obviously more extreme, Kumasi is not a place that we go and take pictures of. And until the V&A's Tropical Modernism exhibition last year, what is a world-class campus, in my view, at KNUST has been left basically invisible. The fact that it's come to attention is really down to the work of a few scholars in Ghana, like Kojo Durban, and a group at Liverpool University led by Ian Jackson and Ola Uduku. But my point really is that what happens in Kumasi is at another level. It's not only that it's overlooked or seen in the way that we want to see it, but when we actually do see it, we don't recognize it. So the basic spatial typology, and I mentioned this at the Unity Hall building, the basic spatial typology you find in Ghana domestically is the compound. And it's a really sophisticated, flexible spatial arrangement which brings together extended families, separate families, work, play, living, all into this one complex space. But we don't have them in Europe or the United States, so they largely go unnoticed. We don't recognize this as architecture. But that's what is at the heart of Unity Hall. And then when we go out into the streets, and this is the kind of apocryphal story I heard from Leslie Locko when I was there, which is that a group, and I won't say which country they were from, but they were European, they went to Accra and they said, you know, the problem with Accra is that it's got 1/3 the amount of public space that healthy cities should have. And they had a figure, they'd worked it out. But they didn't count this. And this is multi-layered, self-organizing, super sophisticated, absolutely remarkably sophisticated public space. But one imagines that they didn't find a place that they could have a flat white, and so they dismissed it. Okay. Romantic images of both, let's work with them. When we do actually recognize these places, when we do see them for themselves, and this is now, in these two instances, between 60 and 70 years after they were built, I think they still sway us with a sense of purpose as well as their aesthetic appeal. A purpose and a restraint that is aligned with the political and social conditions in which they were conceived. Places which we can readily identify in relation to what we might broadly call the progressive post-war settlement. Firstly, on the right, the building of a social democratic state, the Second Finnish Republic, in the aftermath of the devastation of two wars, the loss of 10% of the country's territory and the displacement of 12% of its population. And on the left, the creation of the first independent African country following European colonialism and the replacement of an extractive economy with planned African socialism. Now, we could dismiss all of this as nostalgia. We could say, well, that was then, we don't have to worry about that. But I'm happy with that because I think nostalgia can be a really positive force if and when it provokes us to change and make things better in the here and now. But for that to happen, and for any of these projects to be a spur to action, we would need to stop just treating them as pictures. We'd need to start looking and identifying how the people involved in making them were able to achieve these projects. Which we don't get. What we get is yet another picture of mid-century modernism or glorious brutalism, etc., etc. But to be forgiving, where we are now in 2025 is enough to make any of us put on the rosiest of rose-tinted spectacles and imagine what it might be like to work in halcyon days far away. I'm not going to go through a litany of all the things that are troublesome, how, the climate catastrophe, how we've allowed and still encouraged that to get worse and worse, the loss of biodiversity, the complete moral failure of our building industry, which we are part of. I include architecture of that. And I would recommend, if no one has, they go and read Peter Aps's book, Show Me the Bodies, about Grenfell. We work with, as architects, let alone any of the other professional bodies, we work with the Architects Registration Board, which spends its life coming, as Kate knows, coming for us in education whilst failing to regulate its own register, allowing architects to sign design and build contracts. Why? Because they're resigned to the economy. And if our professional bodies are leading us this poorly, it's really difficult for the rest of us. Hence, as I said, some resignation. But I'm going to show you one stat. And this is about the growth of housing benefit versus the amount of money spent. It's the amount of money spent on benefits versus buildings. And this is from the Chartered Institute of Housing report last year. So this country, currently, our government, adjusted for inflation, spends more money on housing than it did in 1975. But in 1975, we built 100,000 social housing units. Where that money now, 21, 22, where that 26.8 billion is going is into the pockets of private landlords as housing benefit. So it's this enormous transference of taxpayers' money, sound like a politician, into the private pockets, which means there's no money, apparently, to build anything. Yes, there is, but it would take reform. And it does sort of make you think, why bother trying to set up a housing masters as we did, if this is actually what's driving building, is what's driving architecture? Why bother trying to really promote retrofit and adaptive reuse when government taxes it at 20% VAT, but new build is zero rated? We've got to get in there. And we might not want to think of those as architectural issues, but they are the things that actually drive what gets built and what doesn't. But what we actually do, by and large, and this is why I think this question of looking at pictures is important, is whilst we don't want to think about these things, we know that they are what's happening, but we ignore them and we look the other way. And we do two things that I think actually are effectively the same, fundamentally two sides of the same coin. The first one of which is very simple, as the building industry and so many architects have. We simply see architecture as the glorified wallpaper of capital. And I'm going to talk about this as, I'm much happier to talk about the capitalist scene than I am about the Anthropocene, because from where I'm standing, people in the planet got on just fine for years and years and years. It's the system that we're operating that has caused an absolute catastrophe. And so, I think that's the era that we're living in. And we're encouraged to just go along with projects as though that development model is inevitable. We know it may be producing an unjust environment. We know that it might be damaging the common good. We know it may be damaging the environment. But it's a sort of shrug. It's going to happen. That's the way the world works. We let it go. And the same happens with technology. And at KNUST, here's the new building for the Faculty of Arts, fully air-conditioned and an insulated building built by a member of the faculty, actually, in front of Buckminster Fuller's little dome that he did in the 60s. And I show this because I don't blame them for doing this. This is what progress looks like. This is a modern building. And so despite the rest of the campus exemplifying how you can build something completely passively ventilated, this is what modernity looks like. And we're building them all the time. Is it any surprise anyone else is? We're not saying, we're not resisting that. And in the second instance, when we're not just going along with it, we tell ourselves stories about architecture not really being about development, not really being about economics, not really being about any of that stuff. We talk about it as phenomena in which we claim that the essence of architecture and place is a deeper reality that exists outside the exigencies of the here and now. We tell ourselves stories about buildings that just happened, a kind of myth of the given, and which reifying certain individuals and places. This is Peter Zumthor in Upper Swiss Mountain and in Hyde Park, because clearly the thing that Hyde Park needs most is a garden, is to spare us from confronting all the overwhelming qualities of the time we live in. And the fact that buildings are actually created through human agency, dealing with complexities of ecologies, making, technology, labour, and so on and so forth. This is our myth that we tell ourselves. The historical canon may be long dead, but we maintain an equally narrow set of idealised reference points. so long as they are at a distance from the complexities and the negotiations of the world as found, and as long as they photograph well. This kind of discourse is profoundly anti-historical and bears the mark of what Eric Hobsbawm has called the 20th century denial of history. A belief that we can step outside history, which is to say humanity, to overcome time and circumstance and permit a more or less discrete will to be placed above the chaos of life. It also generates a powerful social mythology in modern architectural practice, which is a hiatus between the explicit products, the buildings, the places, the landscapes that we make, and the implicit processes that we make them with, processes that we are not able to articulate to ourselves, let alone others. And somewhere along the line, since the buildings I've shown you in Helsinki and Kumasi, we've stopped thinking about architecture as something argued for and against, negotiated and assembled, and we've started to treat it as this set of passive phenomena. But as early as 1946, referring to that passivity inherent in Martin Heidegger's phenomenological philosophy, Hannah Arendt called it a dangerously irresponsible naturalistic superstition, and I think she's right, in which the moral and political value of human spontaneity is dangerously downgraded. I'll leave the last words on this to another Harry, the great Harry Belafonte, who in 1959 said, "Purism is the best cover-up for mediocrity." If we can't state our concrete synthetic skills, I can't see how we can answer society, let alone our students, when they ask us, what's the point of an architect? Well, actually, that's more or less been answered by society, both in the loss of status of architects, but also in the way that we've allowed the kind of ubiquitous rise of things like design and build contracts, which just take us away from actually doing things, running things, to being just a hard hand, and in the way that a whole series of professions have risen up to take on the kind of things that we no longer do, but which we used to find second nature. So not realizing that whilst things might not be very important to us and rather distasteful to us because they don't conform to this image, it turns out these sorts of things are really rather important to everyone else. And so professions have arisen of urban design, interior architects, urban planners, project managers, landscape and environmental designers, doing the work that architects have given up. And parallel to that, we seem to find it very difficult to take new things up because we define what we do as idealized and so narrow. So, for instance, it's been going on for 40 years, but it's only very, very recently that we finally find the architectural establishment grudgingly accepting that retrofit and adaptive reuse might actually be real architecture. So what do? We call the doctor. And I'm going to be very pragmatic and try and wrap this up. The first one is, I think we just have to restate our citizenship and our values as professionals and take on those responsibilities that our professional bodies have relinquished. We're going to have to build alliances, and we can't rely on our own bodies to push forward the mutual obligations that we have. I'm going to leave that there. What I want to talk about now is the second part of this, which is I think we have got to reassert our unique skills, which I don't think is some mystical process of design, but I think is an ingenious capacity for synthesis, reconciling conflicting demands into an uplifting and supportive environment. To do this, I think we need to build up a body of knowledge and an evolving set of practices which are articulated to ourselves and to others. And I suggest that we follow on from Arendt in rejecting the ideas about essence and advocating for architecture and place and territories as a contested space of spontaneity, action and plurality. Reconceiving the history of architecture and architectural practice so that, in the words of Frederick Jameson, it reclaims its critical capacity to, I quote, reveal what has been taken to be eternal or natural, to be merely historical. A political space, if you like, in which our students can step out and see one another and the world, and in which they can locate their agency. And the quote that sticks in my mind is this one by Joseph Albers. Instead of a weak history of narratives of heroes, mastery, defined certainties, cautionary tales that we can take or leave, depending on whether we like it immediately, what we need to do is build a strong history that's highly critical, highly partial, locates patterns of wisdom in the making of the built environment, which is also polycentric, made up of multiple entwining hybrid centers, and recovers the agencies that shaped it. So we need to ban, as a start, the use of all that generalizing waffle about the global south or the Nordic model, and start viewing places like Kumasi and Helsinki the way they do themselves, cities with their own distinctive histories, cultures and interests. And I suggest we stop treating architectural history as a kind of bicycle wheel in which spokes radiate from a superior centre to a rim of lesser places, and replace it with something rhizomatic, a non-hierarchical polycentric network of exchanges that take place in real time between real places. Centres of excellence with their own narratives, not the lens of people looking in from abroad. And within that polycentric space, I think we should reconceptualize history as that rhizomatic, messy, hazy, networked, sophisticated, entangled set of practices. Something that Alvar Aalto actually conveyed in a 1955 essay called Art and Technology, in which he quotes from the Swedish poet and playwright August Strindberg's cycle, Trinity Sunday Night. I quote, "Gold powder in an iron deposit, copper snake under a silver linden. This is the wood nymph's riddle. This is yours and mine." A history that understands that the how is the what, that we have to immerse ourselves in the chaos of what we find ourselves, or the reality of what we find ourselves, and find through our processes a way of making art in this case, or simply architecture. I'd like to think in a clumsy kind of way. I try to do that in the studios here, but you can be the judge of that. What I'm going to end with is the work I've tried to do around this, which is all around the work of the Aalto Atelier, which I'm going to talk about now. In 2011, I wrote and edited a book with my late friend and colleague Vezio Nava. And it was an oral history project. We did 23 conversations, definitely not interviews, which we set up between people who'd worked in the Aalto Atelier going back to 1944. And we talked also to engineers who'd worked with the Aalto Atelier and furniture designers and makers. And our intention was really simple. We wanted to explore what the Atelier members themselves called the handwork, the kädenjälki of the Atelier, the habits, the skills, the techniques that relate architectural purpose to reality. And we had a real starting point to this. We wanted to know how could such a small atelier manage to build so much, so well? How did it obtain commissions? How did the atelier organize itself? What was the atelier's ambience? What were the contentions? What were the contingencies? And we wanted to restore that narrative, that set of agencies, to the story of the Aalto Atelier, which we'd both worked in. Vezio was the site architect of the Riola Church in Italy, which some of you may have visited. And we started with the two partners of, well, I should say the three partners of the Alto Atelier. Everyone knows about Alvar Alto, but it's quite common to neglect the two partners he had. Firstly, Ino Alto, who he worked in partnership with from 1924 until her death in 1949, and Elisa Alto, who I ended up working for, who was his partner from 1958 to till 1976 when he died, and carried on with the artistic responsibility for the atelier till her own death in 1994. Hey, it's no surprise that, but it's no less reprehensible that two women partners should be written out of the story. But we saw putting them back in as an absolutely critical part of this work that we needed to do. We also saw it as critical to put in the people who had worked in the atelier, hence the oral conversations. And we wanted to give voice to them and how they went about their work. And what the conversations we did actually showed was how the atelier formed an absolutely integral part of what we call Alvar Alto's creative achievement. It's not that, it's the achievement of an atelier of partnership and colleagues. And we wanted to supplant the speculation that takes place in most modern architectural history with the authority of the voices of those who actually helped design the buildings, and to illustrate what is actually an incredibly pragmatic artistry of the atelier, and provide a kind of messier history, if you like, which is not just about finished products, but or moralizing speculations of what may or may not lie behind them, but simply tells of the difficulties and the pleasures of architectural practice. And actually what if I look back on this project, and it's still ongoing to some degree, what actually comes out of this is the most important quality of this atelier was trust. And that begins in recruitment and extends through the way the entire office was set up to, on the basis of that trust, to give people incredible freedom and agency to lead on buildings. Hence, Alvar Alto's most noted comment, and actually what I wanted to call the book, but the publishers wouldn't allow it, was he would go around, and whenever people complained that there was a problem, and they'd say, oh, we can't do this because of the budget, he'd just say, we don't need to be so dogmatic. There's always a way of solving this problem because we know what we're doing. Then, and this is, again, examples of the atelier at work. Sorry, I missed this slide. Big scale modelling was really important to them, which is another thing, and mock-ups. And then in another project, which was just on this building, the House of Culture in Helsinki, we really sought a different set of things to come into the story, which was the labour of the building. And so we really wanted to get that sense of this is an extraordinary building, and to bring out the quality of the work. These are Hélène Binet's photographs of the fabrication, the matter of this, but both the skill of the workers and the beauty of the artifacts that they created, all on the most extraordinarily tight budget. And then finally, another bit of work which has been stimulated by an exhibition at Bard College in New York and resulted in a book on Artec, which was a really simple thing of trying to work out what it was about the Alto furniture that made it so incredibly popular, particularly in Britain before the war and after the war. So that how did this furniture come about? Partly networks of people like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy being part of the associated with the atelier, and then somehow it becoming integral to a kind of particular image of modernity in Britain. And I keep finding these, they're great. They're just, this stool, this S60 stool just keeps appearing here, there, and everywhere. From Anna Freud's consulting room to David Bailey showing Jean Shrimpton how to pose. Isn't that great? And I don't know if Roberto made it tonight, but Roberto Patazzi and I went out to Turin, I think in 2018, I think it was the year before, yeah, and we went to see this man, Leonardo Mosso, who was a great associate of Alto's, worked in the atelier for a long time, and is also one of the fathers of computational architecture. And there's a relationship between the two, so we haven't finished this, in fact. We've kind of, yeah, that's another project that we'll get on with. So, to end with, all the material that the conversations with the Alto Atelier, with John Owusu-Addo revealed was fascinating, but it's also really unsurprising. It's what pretty much all practitioners accumulate through practice. The difference is that the members of the Alto Atelier and John Owusu-Addo are aware of their knowledge and practices and value them, and understood that they gained something through those practices being engaged rather than being diminished by that process. So, on the basis that it's so straightforward, building a wider history of practice shouldn't be beyond us. It's just a task of recovery, extricating the stories from their unacknowledged tacit state, buried within our day-to-day practices, to build a shared body of knowledge and practices to which we can refer to as second nature, if you like, a rule of thumb. Something that I believe has the potential to help us in the future by showing us how we accomplished things in the past. Thank you. Oh, actually. Maybe we'll have the bit of light.
Yeah. Could we have the lights on? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe take seats.
You might want to get a drink. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm all right. I've had a glass of water. If I don't have a drink, then it'll be quicker.
We'll make it quick, and then we can carry on discussing the talk with Harry thereafter. So, Harry, thank you firstly for that talk. Incredibly interesting, complex, layered, evocative. And so, what I'm going to suggest I do, because there are very many thirsty-looking people in the room. What I'm going to do is certainly not question you. I'm going to spend a minute or two sharing some thoughts about the talk. Of course, this is unrehearsed, so it's high risk.
So is mine.
There you go. Well done. And then after sharing my thoughts, perhaps I won't question you, but I might ask you for a point of elaboration, and you can respond in any way you wish, and then we'll close and celebrate. So firstly, again, thank you. Incredibly tantalizing talk for a number of reasons. For me, primarily because you were talking about, in terms of the core of your talk, you were talking about two projects. One which you have a deep history of engagement and understanding and knowledge, and the other one, in Kumasi, which is very much in its infancy. So that tension I felt was a productive one, underpinned, of course, by this question of the overlooked. And so what was kind of interesting to me is when you were talking about the overlooked and the contexts of both Addo's work and Alto's work, you adopted a very non-architectural way, I guess, in a normative sense, of understanding their work and the buildings that they designed. And you adopted what I think is a far more cultural studies approach to understanding objects as things of analysis and inquiry. So you were pointing to the political and social contexts that surrounded and shaped the formation of their work, which I thought was interesting. Primarily, and this is the core of my observation, is that you were consistently talking about questions of representation. And I'm thinking of representation in two ways in relation to your talk. Firstly is representation in the political sense, so speaking or recovering on behalf of others, whether that's underrepresented subjects, objects, communities. And then the second meaning for me of representation is re-presentation. So re-presentation. And you strayed into that territory when you spoke about what images convey, how looking and writing about the past works or ought to work. So that the question of method and historiography came to the fore. There's a tension there as well. So my question really is a kind of, from an architectural perspective, a really selfish one, actually. And it has to do with looking back, and it has to do with the past, it has to do with nostalgia, and to some extent, it's to do with lament. And that is in relation to the building. Your images had lots of context, but every now and again, a building popped up. These modernist, iconic figures, potent and powerful, full of associations, which we've long since buried in our deepest recesses. So for me, the question is to you, Harry, or the request for elaboration, is in your work, what is the utility of looking just at the building as opposed to its context? You mentioned the word style once in the talk, but it was a very powerful reference. So that's the request. Can you, Professor Charrington, please elaborate on what you think the ongoing utility of the building is as an object of analytical currency and inquiry?
Cool.
Thank you.
I was going to thank you for all your kind words, Samir, and I'm not so sure now. There is the person who's here who might answer this better than me in a way is Sean, but it's got to be me. It's his turn in October, but Sean talks. There is something about the encounter. There is something really about the encounter with buildings, places, and that sort of moment of engagement with the project, and that moment, that is the moment where we do react. We have that immediate emotional contact with the place, and we might be negative, might be positive, might be neutral, might be whatever. I find it really difficult though, because I'm aware that if you go to somewhere in the sunshine or in the rain, you feel pretty differently about them. If you go to it when you've just had a row with somebody, or everything's rosy, it changes how you do it. So I think it is a really difficult thing to get a handle of. I myself find it's been an education, being working quite a lot of my professional life in schools with other professions in. And so it was with civil engineering at Bath, it was planning in UWE, and in Finland there are no such things as planners, but then there aren't, in the same breath, there aren't any architects either, because architecture and planning is covered by architects, which means architects do more, that they're an expanded profession compared to here. And engineers creep in as well, but in some way. But the point of that is that when you talk to them, they have very clear ideas about what architecture is, very often, which is very different from our own, hence why you said that, which I find really helpful, because they simply will talk about things with a plainness, actually, very often, that I might miss, because they see it somewhat differently. But the other side of it is that the word architecture to them implies a building, whereas to me architecture is a much broader thing. And there are occasions, instances where I've been to a building where you think of it, as you talk about the utility, on its own. But actually, as soon as you're there, you realise that what you're responding to is the relationship between that building that you're part of and its environment and its history. So, one level, if I think of a building that really was extraordinary, and I think of it as a building in its own right, say the Salk Institute by Lou Kahn. It is absolutely extraordinary. It is absolutely four square, and you can think of it as an object, except everything to do with it really is derived from the Pacific Ocean and the site that it sits on. So it's relational. And in the end, it is the fact that we design relationships that makes us architects, makes us planners, not product designers. Because I haven't got my mobile phone in my pocket, but if your mobile phone is a product, it's the same wherever it goes. It doesn't change. But actually, buildings, places are all involved with climate, time, place. I don't know if that answers it. I'm not sure I'm very comfortable thinking about buildings on their own.
Nor am I, which is precisely the reason for the question, and I'm very thankful for you for saying that. So that was your response and your elaboration. So thank you very much. And I am going to suggest that we put a marker for a year's time for a follow-up talk, because there is something extraordinarily interesting about the potential of what you started, Harry, to inform the ongoing discourse on post-colonial contexts and questions of decolonising architecture and questions of the canon. Yeah. So I thank you in advance for doing all that good work, and we will see you and I hope everyone here back in this space to hear more. So just to end with, thank you, and can we please have a final round of thanks, round of applause for Professor Harry Charrington.
Thank you. Cheers, Samir. Thank you.
And we'll see you at the back of the room.